Well, a multinodal world looks pretty much like the world we're in, except that we're in the United States, which is at the top of the world we're in. So in order to appreciate what a general structure of the world is like, we have to get outside, sort of go to the moon or wherever and get a view of a pattern of which we're the primary node. And with China's rise, maybe two primary nodes. But then there's lots of other relationships. If we were in Phnom Penh in Cambodia talking about what a multinodal world looked like, well, we'd see on north of us we'd see Laos. And Laos is a smaller country, and we have upstream problems with Laos on the Mekong River. We could talk about that. And we have, on one side we have Thailand. In Thailand we have a border conflict with. And on the other side we have Vietnam. And both Vietnam and Thailand are much bigger than we are. And we have no border, well, border conflict's pretty much settled with Vietnam, but they occupied Cambodia for a long time. So there's a lot of resentment about Vietnam there. And then we're looking beyond that, we see China. We don't have a border with China, but it's the big country in the area. And then we have our neighborhood regional association of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And that's important, and we're happy to be members of that because that provides us some access and regional respect and things of that sort. And then there's the United States. In the United States we have, it's a complicated relationship in part because of the distance. The United States is not interested in everything that happens in our country, Cambodia. The United States is only interested in sub-aspects, and so the contact is intermittent at the government level, though most of the Dunkin' Donuts in Los Angeles are owned by Cambodians. So, there's more involved than simply state-to-state relationships. But the world from Cambodia's perspective then has different levels of big and small countries. From our perspective, every country is smaller in the economy. Every country has less military. Every country, we're the big country to a whole range of different sized countries. So we could be happy with that, and say, well, so the rest of the world can be as multinodal as they want, but why should we care? Well, the reason we should care is that as the world has developed with greater connectivity, greater globalization, more trade, those containers that the container ships are carrying, standardizing parts and making delivery between countries much easier. The interconnections all over the world are becoming more significant. So countries have more alternatives when dealing with us than they used to. And we need to understand that if we want to have effective relationships with them. It certainly has its effect because China's the world's largest economy, and I think that this current threshold of purchasing power parity is important because purchasing power parity tries to estimate the actual productivity of the country rather than converting things, the currency rates and rates of exchange. Tries to look at, so how many pigs and eggs and steel and whatever does each country produce and the aggregate value of those and compare those without using the exchange value of the currency. So China's at that point. And in all likelihood, China is going to develop a margin above the U.S., and at some point that purchasing power parity margin is going to be large enough so that the currency exchange equality will also be there. So that's happening. What's the significance for the U.S.? Well, it's not insignificant because what it means is that China is a huge producer, and it's the world's largest producer in most major capacities, cement, steel. I think it produces half the world's steel now. So This is not insignificant. We have to deal with it. Besides the production significance of China, it has a market, an expanding market, so that U.S. car makers are selling more cars in China now than they're selling in the U.S. market. So the market is important. And that's an aggregate thing. The aggregate productivity is important. But China has 4 times the U.S. population. So it has per capita productivity is 1/4 of U.S. per capita productivity. And much smaller than German per capita productivity or Japanese or Singapore or Hong Kong or Taiwan. Well, U.S. with this productivity on a smaller population has more discretionary income, and it has a history of high intensity production, high technology production. If you think about it, why do American workers produce 4 times more than Chinese workers? Do they work 4 times as hard? No. It'd be hard to work 4 times as hard and live, than it work 4 times harder than a Chinese worker and live. What happens is their capitalization is greater. And one important security effect of this is that weapons tend to be high tech and tend to be things that demand not just specific innovations, but systemic innovations in order to work. To give a non-military example, China is very good in many advanced aspects of technology that are related to military functions. Nanotechnology, for instance. Nanosensors, it's very good in. But it can't build a Boeing 777. It doesn't even have plans to build a Boeing 777. I don't think that there's any part of a Boeing 777 that China couldn't figure out how to make. But to pull it all together, that requires experience, it requires capital intensivity and experience. And that's a level that affects both high-tech, things like civil aircraft, but also even more so it affects military. If we think of China as a military threat, it's not a symmetric threat. China's not likely to run the same arms race that we're running against ourselves right now. And what it will do is try to run a defensive arms development that will protect what it sees as its territory and its core interest. And that's mainly localized and land-based, but with naval improvements as well, especially not so much projection naval things like carriers. It does have one carrier, but it's trivial compared to American carriers. But coastal protection. There's going to be more tension between governments not being able to, having their options constrained by interdependence, and publics feeling more exposed and therefore wanting solutions to things. Long term, the answer for the government to avoid this kind of crisis is to get into agreed patterns, regional patterns, global patterns, so that the crisis doesn't emerge, so that something can be a World Trade Organization issue instead of a bilateral issue, so that something can be an ASEAN issue instead of a Thailand-Cambodia issue. But when the crisis occurs, that's a hard time to do it.